And I'm Karen Freeman Wilson, President and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, previously the mayor of Gary, Indiana, and Indiana Attorney General.
Make sure I'm on. I'm Quentin Lucas. I feel blessed to be here just looking out at this vista. It's glorious. I'm the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, and that's how I'll start today.
It is a beautiful day indeed. So I just want to remind our guests too that there will be a question and answer portion at the end of the panel. So if you have any questions, please hold. You'll have plenty of time at the end to engage with our panelists. Right now we're going to get our conversation started talking about the context, laying the framework. From your perspective, how does the 2024 election cycle differ from those in our past?
I guess you're looking this way, so I'll start with a few different thoughts. As somebody who just had lunch with a group of college sophomores and juniors, I think it is clear that this election will be more social media influenced than perhaps ever before, in legitimate ways and potentially in illegitimate ones. And so what's going to be important for us as more of our voters, and it isn't just your Gen Z, but millennials and others, are getting information from social media posts, from that type of engagement, that we have truth, and that you have voices that fight back against misinformation. And so I think that what we're going to see, particularly if I do believe the current president will be the Democratic nominee and the former president likely to be the Republican nominee, you may not have things like actual presidential debates of the past. You may not have some of the other official types of things. You're just going to see a whole bunch of social media kind of back and forth. And I think that allows this to be a particularly interesting and challenging discussion ahead.
I think the mayor's absolutely right. In addition to that, it is the first election in modern times where you have seen a federal criminal indictment looming over a candidate. The idea that you could be under indictment in multiple jurisdictions and still be a legitimate candidate for dog catcher, less known president, is just, unfathomable.
I agree. It's also the first election after the year of election denying, about the year of constant issues on county level in terms of election security. And now we have to build back up that voter confidence and to say, yes, your vote still matters. Yes, you should still go out and vote after a very terrible time in 2020.
Also for states like Florida, where we're battling new laws that have just been passed during this last legislative cycle, where there are now provisions put in place where the type of people that can register voters are now limited. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you can't register voters. If you're a returning citizen, you can't register voters. 501c3 organizations that have signed up to register voters are now going to be penalized at a much higher rate than previous years. So there are a lot of obstacles that have been put in place now. I'm speaking specifically for the state of Florida, where a lot of people are not only going to be afraid to vote because of the election police that Governor DeSantis has, but also the provisions that are now put in place to the amount of people that will probably be registered to vote for this upcoming election.
That's actually a really good point. Does anybody else have anything to add with regards to what they may have noticed around voter rights and voting laws that have been passed within recent years?
Yeah, I mean, additions, so the legal terrain has gotten worse over the last several years. And if you look at any number of states, right, 4 years ago we were talking about Georgia, right? We have seen every southern state try to do everything possible they can to make it harder to vote. But you've seen that in swing states too, the Pennsylvania legislature, Michigan, Wisconsin. You have courts and legislatures that continue to try to, if not frustrate ways for people to get out to vote, certainly to make it confusing. And so one of the biggest things that folks who are trying to get people out to vote in 2024 need to do is make sure they know things like, this is what you need to bring. If somebody tries to challenge you, both when you are in line and even when you are voting, these are your rights. You are going to need lots of folks, and God bless you for your work in Florida doing it, who are able to show up to polls, who are able to step up quickly, because I am greatly concerned. One example of this actually speaks to redistricting. In Alabama, right, went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court that they need to redistrict another congressional district to basically have a majority black second district in Alabama. The legislature, after it goes to the United States Supreme Court, says, "Nah, we're still not going to do that." It was just struck down again. I have no doubt that that legislature will keep going. I'm going to try to say this objectively without being partisan, but there is something about the Trump era, since he became president. Folks aren't worried about rules, institutions, laws, standards. What they are worried about is just pure winning, and in some situations trying to run out the clock to do it. And that to me is a very big concern as we come to 2024.
So, as a person who works in national media, a lot of the times you hear correspondents putting out the word or the term unprecedented times, unprecedented times. Would you consider these times unprecedented, and is it hyperbolic to say that democracy is at risk?
There's no question that these times are unprecedented and democracy is at risk, but it really harkens, and as I was listening to the mayor and the other panelists talk about efforts to suppress voters, that takes you all the way back to 1865, 1866. So in a sense, the times are unprecedented, but we're going all the way back in history in an effort to keep an entire body of folks, or multiple bodies, because it's black folks, it's Latinx, it's anybody who thinks differently from what we've seen from the Republican structure. And, no, it's not partisan, but you can just see who's working hard to suppress the vote. They are intent on impacting our democracy in a negative way. And there are many things that we've historically taken for granted that aren't givens.
And it doesn't even happen, sometimes it doesn't even happen in terms of redistricting or in laws. It can happen as simple as in Coffee County, Georgia, where a councilwoman allowed 2 Trump supporters to come into the office and to look around and use a USB card and take information about the voting files and put it on the internet. So it's something that simple that can happen all the time, which is why we have to make sure that we are taking care of our election workers and we are putting protections out there for them, because sometimes it's not even as complicated as we think it is. It's more about who is running our elections. Who are our commissioners? Like the education of, even in your own county, of who these people are, what power they have, and making sure that the elections are going smoothly. That's something, I completely agree with you about the whole post-Trump era and what it's like right now, because to me, that's the biggest thing, is the insider threats and outsider threats of election workers that makes it difficult for people to feel comfortable going to vote.
In addition to what the other panelists have said, we're also experiencing different versions of disenfranchising black and brown communities. So originally, it was the jelly bean test in order for you to be able to register to vote. Now they're purging rolls. Now they're tightening our voter state laws on what IDs can be used in order to vote. And a lot of these things are affecting the migrants that are coming into our communities, where they don't have a voice in democracy at all, because they can't get access to these different resources or get access to these different IDs that are needed to have their voices heard on election day. And then also I would say within the state of Florida, it's just a lot going on, but the purging of rolls has been that has been a hot topic that many people, it doesn't matter if you have voted every election since you have registered, everyone needs to check their voter registration status because they are going to try to purge rolls and people will show up on election day and they're not on the roll. And then we don't have same-day voter registration, so you just basically have to sit it out.
Debria, what about the restorative rights movement in Florida? What's the update on that? I had that question.
So with the restorative rights movement in Florida, it's basically returning citizens having the rights to vote with, as long as you didn't have a felony that was murdering someone or sexual assault, you could have your rights restored and you could vote. That has been under attack in Florida, and now not only are those citizens not allowed to vote or are afraid to vote, there's no way for them to go and check to make sure everything that they were supposed to do was done correctly. So if their fines and fees haven't been paid, it's no way for them to check that. So essentially, you think you have your rights restored, you served your time, you register to vote, and then you go on election day and you vote, and then 2 months later, potentially you could get arrested because they're saying, oh, you really didn't have the right to vote. But you're like, hey, I got my voter registration card, the state issued this, so if the state isn't checking to see who's eligible to vote, then I don't have the resources to check who's eligible to vote. It's like it gets to the election police, and it's like they're the only department that has these resources, and that's what's leading to a lot of returning citizens not feeling comfortable with having their voices heard on election day either. And now they can't even register voters as well.
Thank you for that breakdown of that system. Can you talk more about just why stricter voter ID laws in specific disproportionately affect Black and brown voters?
In a lot of instances, and we've certainly seen this in Indiana and Illinois, there is, Black voters are less likely to simply have ID. Black voters are less likely to have driver's licenses. And even though they issue state IDs in a number of places, you have to have certain documents. You see all over airports, real ID. Get ready for real ID. Well, for the real ID, you need a birth certificate. You need a social security card. And I don't know if anybody applied for a social security card in the era of COVID. That was like getting, some type of special document. And that's just your social security card because people weren't working from their offices. And so if you think about that in the context of needing an official state ID to vote, that just increases that barrier, and it's a problem. It's a problem.
Debria, I know you mentioned that one thing that people should be doing as they get ready and prepare to vote is to check their status. For the rest of our panelists, what else would you want people to understand about the process of voting and making sure that you are set up and prepared to participate in the election?
A few different things. So in addition to checking to make sure you're on the rolls, check to make sure you know where you're voting. They move, it happened to me actually too, right? You've been voting the same place for 10, 15 years. Some election, is somewhere brand new. And that has happened. That came up in Georgia not long ago. It's come up in other states where they say, oh, now we're going to make everybody in the county go to this one spot. That's one thing to be ready for, particularly for those of you who, not just in swing states, presidential elections, almost every state, be ready to wait in a line, potentially. And sometimes there may be long ones. Make sure you know that if you're in line at poll closure, you still get to vote, right? And so making sure you have those steps kind of along the way. And then knowing the opportunity to place and vote in a provisional ballot, at least in my state and in other jurisdictions. So if you get allegedly turned away, nobody can just tell you you can't vote, go on, all that sort of stuff. The fact that you still have rights in connection with it. And the other thing that I would ask y'all who are very well informed to do, make sure you're sharing that with others. Because, for example, the state next door to mine, Kansas, had a vote on abortion rights last summer. Huge turnout, people who hadn't voted for ages. I was able to get some people to vote, and I was like, I didn't even know you were registered. But, right, a lot of it was for them saying, I don't even know what the process is. Make sure you tell them those several things, because it is real easy, particularly if somebody hasn't voted or somebody's trying to get them not to, for them to feel like they should be turned away. And so making sure you have that messaging makes a huge difference.
I would say get a sample ballot and do as much research as you possibly can if you don't know who is running your state. Through the years that Debria and I worked in civic engagement in Florida, we came to understand that civic education is something that's lacking of, people not knowing where to vote and when, but also not knowing who and what they are voting for. Because 2024 is the general election, we forget that there's also things happening locally and that there are things on the ballot that is state for the states, and it takes some time and energy to go out into your community and to educate people on what's on the ballot. And if there's no one in your community that's doing that, I suggest you get a sample ballot, you get online and you look up who is on the ballot, what do they stand for, what do they do in my state, to make a very knowledgeable vote.
And can I co-sign on a point you made? On these constitutional questions and issue questions, information is key. Because there will be people that try to just push a community to a yes or a no, and it'll be the exact opposite of what you think they're trying to do or say. And making sure you know what that yes or no means. And there are all these that are often thrown on in these November elections. So making sure that information on the issue questions is going to be a big part of what we try to do.
What we've seen a lot in jurisdictions in both Indiana and Illinois are questions relative to funding for schools, right? And a lot of times, because it's attached to taxes, we will say no, right? Because I don't want my taxes to go up. And I think it's important that we educate voters. And when I say we educate voters, it's really fraternities, it's sororities, it's other civic organizations. YPs, if you're a member of the Urban League or the NAACP, to inform people about what it really means to increase school funding, to say yes or no, so that you allow them to think about how it impacts their lives. It's easy to say no if you're just talking about taxes, right? But it's a lot harder to say no if you're talking about the quality of schools that your children are entitled to. And I just want to just encourage everybody in the room to do something to make the electoral process better. You know, we talk about not just voting. I think the mayor mentioned taking people or helping people vote. If you just tell 10 of your family members, you need to vote, because if you ask 10 of them if they voted in the last election, half of them are going to say no.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because the Human Rights Watch group, there's a research group, they said that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are on the front line of protecting the integrity of elections. The sororities, fraternities, Urban League, and organizations of the like. Do you have any examples of any pushback that you all may have faced while working with your organizations to expand voter access? I know that sometimes it's not always welcome. And what does that look like? How do you handle it in real time?
I would say, and I can only speak on sororities and civic engagement within the Divine Nine. Sometimes when we go out to certain communities, we get pushback because people just aren't comfortable with, number one, talking about politics, learning about politics, and trusting the system. And to no fault of our own, being black and brown people in this country, it's not like this system has always worked for us anyway. So some communities don't feel like they're being represented anyway. No one is coming to ask them. And I do agree, a lot of times when there are elections, elected officials or people running for those positions sometimes come in and tell them the plans that they have for them, as opposed to asking what is needed in this community. So I do feel like a lot of times we feel like, oh, people, black people just don't care about voting. That's not true. It's the fact that we have not benefited a lot of times from voting. And a lot of times if we are out pushing for people to vote, we're pushing for interest and, I would say, resources that don't necessarily benefit us solely. So it's like no one's ever advocating for us. It's like we're always advocating for other groups. So it's like, when is it our time to benefit from the political process?
Does anybody else have any insight on that? Or maybe anything you've heard from outside groups?
I'm going to take us back to '08. President Obama was very successful. A lot of that success came from the involvement of the faith community and the involvement of nonprofit organizations, just driving voter turnout. However, right after that, some of you, you may or may not remember, letters from the IRS went out, especially to the faith community, saying your charter, your 501c3 status is in danger. Be careful. There were warning letters, veiled threats. And so in 2012, you didn't have that level of activity because essentially they had said, we don't want you involved in this process. When everybody has the right, and I think it's important if you're a member of one of those organizations to understand you have the right to be involved in getting the vote out. In this last mayoral election in Chicago, the Chicago Urban League spent $200,000 to make sure people knew where to vote and the fact that there was a second election. Nonpartisan. We didn't support any particular candidate, but we wanted to drive the number up. And I would say we were successful in doing that.
Because the real story on a lot of this is that they're trying to suppress turnout. Right? Fundamental to every one of these tactics, fundamental actually to why we have negative campaign ads, is more about voter trying to suppress turnout, trying to make sure people aren't having their voices heard. And what we are seeing targeting done against black communities largely is trying to find every way possible to do it. So on the far front end, it's television ads, it's others, it's trying to spray confusion, it's all those sorts of things. On the show up on election day sort of thing, it's saying your vote won't make a difference, it's going to be hard to find it, and beyond. And so what is important is for a lot of our organizations, and that is another place where we can help and assist, is making sure that your organizations that frankly are trusted better in many cases than just the mayor standing up, or look, God knows, depending on your governor, the governor standing up. And instead saying, we are this fraternity, we are this sorority, we are an urban league that's saying we want to make sure y'all get out there, you have your voices heard. I'll give you an example. I got a cousin in Iowa, several, and they're interesting. Because I went to visit them once and I said, y'all gonna do something in the Iowa caucuses? And they were like, nah, we just tired of it. And I'm like, come on, y'all. Y'all some of the few Americans who get to make an early decision. And they said, well, all we hear are just negative ads, people telling us that, it doesn't matter and all that. I'm like, that's exactly what they want. You need to get out there. You need to make your voice heard. And us making sure through our organizations and groups and voices that we're carrying that, I think is key for us.
Thank you, Mayor. On the issue of trust, the House Oversight Committee recently shared data in June saying that 37% of Democratic-leaning voters and 71% of Republican-leaning voters lacked confidence in the election system's accuracy. So what is the best way, or is there a way to regain the public's faith in our country's electoral systems and processes? Do you think that it's possible?
I was going to say, I think with that, education is important. So one of the, Wendy mentioned during her opening statement that people in 2016 were baffled on how Hillary Clinton could win the popular vote but lose the election. So I feel like those statistics may be coming from people that generally don't believe in our electoral system and the way that things are right now, but they're also not understanding that you don't win the popular vote and win the election. There's more to it than that. And yes, those things can be revamped. We can, completely dismantle and start over. That's going to be a process. But the systems that are put in place now is, you have to get so many electoral votes and things of that nature. So I think with those statistics, it's probably more so of educational piece of Americans aren't really taught these things. Like, I don't recall going to school and being taught about the electoral system, or if I did, it was something that was like glanced over. It was something that was like a quick lesson. So something that I do like about the work that we're doing with Campus Vote Project is that we're institutionalizing reforms and trying to break down the barriers on civic education and increasing the youth vote, because they're our future. So if we empower and educate them early, then we won't have statistics like the one that you just said. It will be more people believing in the system and hopefully not putting people in positions of power that's telling you that the election was a fraud and the votes didn't count.
Any other thoughts on how to regain the public's trust?
I'll just say there's something I've always loved about black political activism is that when we do a lot of work to engage people, it doesn't just help us. And so what I take from a lot of the efforts we're doing in getting people registered to vote, right? When we have urban voter registration drives, it's not just black folks that we're registering, right? When we're actually making sure we're getting information about issues on the ballot, when we get on television, that doesn't just go to our community. And so to me, a lot of it and the way you dispel it is the fact that we are putting messages out there that are for everybody. The Urban League, I imagine, just didn't get its stuff to black Chicagoans. There are a whole bunch of people in Chicago who are learning about their ability to vote, that there's an election, and all of that from the information out there. So I think just us saying, what are the official things you need, right, that there is this fair process, is going to do a lot to make sure we push back. Now, I'm not going to be naive, because you've got a major, actually not one, you've got like 15 major presidential candidates who, despite the fact they've all been elected to something, say they don't believe in elections, oddly enough. Some of whom even in states where they also got elected. But, so it just means that is going to be an ongoing area of pushback and need to say, no, this is legitimate, this is real. And I think that's how we actually do it. we're not going to dispel necessarily the fact that President Trump's going to run around the country and say everything's fake and all of that now, or if he loses, when he loses, hopefully, in my view. But I think it's going to be imperative for people to say, this is fair, we showed everybody how it could be, and we tried to share that with everyone.
I think the mayor raises a good point. When you look at those statistics that you just gave, 71% of Republicans, 37% of Democrats, it means that there is an active, concerted effort to misinform people and to get them to believe that elections cannot be trusted. Now, when you also look at the investigations that happened, and that by and large, when you look at the investigations in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Nevada, in Arizona, little to no fraud was found. People didn't hear about the absence of fraud being found. They heard about the belief that there was fraud and an investigation was underway. And what I will say is the folks who really promote illegitimacy are better at their jobs than the people who know that there is integrity in elections.
That's powerful. Thank you. I want to turn the conversation to the youth vote. Talking about how Gen Z has historically had a higher turnout than previous generations at the same age. They're very revved up, very socially driven. What has been your experience with getting the youngest generation of voters out and politically engaged?
I think that social media has been an amazing tool that has really helped with all of that. We've seen with organizations and even a lot of mayors and states have been using social media to get messages out to their voters in their city or in their county. And having that amount of access to information is automatically gonna increase turnout because there's a lot of education that's there and they care and they've grown up with technology so much that, it's at their fingertips, so I'm not surprised.
I would say with Gen Z, specifically on college campuses, they are, I don't want to say more engaged, but they've experienced Trump's era, so they know what society looks like under certain leadership. And with that, it has opened the doors to some groups being unapologetically hateful and not hiding those things anymore. And then there are other groups that are unapologetically informed and that are going to go out and engage their communities to ensure that they have the information needed. And I think the youth vote in 2022 saved a lot of elections. So now, moving into 2024, that's the vote that's going to be attacked the most. It's the youth vote. So we're going to see ads that are, Jaleesa and I were talking earlier about ads that are being AI generated and how some policies are going to put in place now that if an ad is AI generated, they're going to have some type of tagline on it where this is not something that was created by this specific party or something like that. So I feel like since Gen Z has information at their fingertips, people are now going to try to use that for the worst. So it's like now you're going to be boggled down with all of this overflow of information, and now you're going to have to try to figure out what's true and what's not true. So moving forward into 2024, it's really going to be like a mind game because they don't want you to vote. They don't care what you have to say, but at the same time, Gen Z is the generation that's moving us into 2024 and beyond. So I don't know. I just feel like the youth vote is what's going to be attacked, unfortunately, although they are the most engaged group right now.
I mean, that's kind of the concern of what we've been talking about before, right? So our youth voters are the ones most likely to be voting for the first time, right? The ones who some may try to say, oh, we don't have you on the rolls, or we're in this space or that space. And so I think the important bridge for us is going to be, how do we make sure we get that person who is engaged, who's actively following candidates, issues, campaigns on social media to the polls as well. But I agree on this point. When I first got elected, there were more people over 80 who voted in our municipal election, over 80, than people between 18 and 30. And in case y'all wondering about the demographics of my city and most of them, a whole lot more people between 18 and 30 versus 80 and 100 or what have you. And so what that says is we got a lot of people to get out, and we have a lot of folks who I think understand the issues to the point you were making, who've been around these last 4 crazy years, but who also we need to know and say, these polls matter, the elections matter, and frankly, the reason that we have Reverend Warnock as a senator, for example, now versus Herschel Walker, or frankly, probably Joe Biden as a president rather than Donald Trump, is because young people showed up in key states, and we need to see that again.
We talked a lot about safety attacks. I understand that there were real fears of attacks on election workers, especially following January 6th, but even before that, in the 2020 election. How do you recruit election workers now in a time when they would be operating under an increasingly hostile environment?
Well, a part of the work that I do is trying to get states, as well as on the county level, for them to put some ordinances or laws to protect election workers. Some states don't really do that. They don't look at how election workers are being harassed and treated. So right now we are pushing to make sure that there's some protection there, but it does make it hard in the same breath to say, hey, this is what's happening, but oh, hey, be a poll worker. Like, come put yourself in there. So I do think it's both of, yes, we do want to recruit, because the more people that we can have trained to be in there and do it correctly, the better. But it's also advocating to make sure that there are laws in place that have some type of penalties for harassment for both insider and outsider threats with election workers.
I would say make it a federal crime. What we've seen, and there are 2 things that I think speak to that. One is the prosecution of people from the January 6th insurrection. They are still identifying and prosecuting folks, and they are taking it very seriously. But the other thing is, how many of you have seen folks act a fool on a plane and get walked off? No. Or have somebody meet them when everybody is deboarding the plane? People don't do that anymore. It used to be a regular thing. But folks started to understand that if you are out of the way, or if you act or treat a flight attendant in a certain manner, you're going to be held accountable. And typically people change their behavior when there are federal consequences versus them being, and I think you do need the state protections, but I think that people pay closer attention when there are federal consequences.
How is the increase in election denialism affecting the process of being at the polls, whether you are there helping to administer the polls or just being a watcher?
Well, Debria, you could probably speak a lot more on this in Florida about how now they're you can't really be at the polling location. You can't really do parties and drop off people. You can't really give water out. There's a lot of protection around on that day of people not doing that, but there's not a lot on the days leading up to that. The election denying is so hurtful to voter confidence. And again, the only thing that I can say, and I'm so open to hearing what the other panelists have to say, is making sure that there is those provisions that are there to build that voter confidence and say, hey, we actually have security here, and this is how our elections are working, and to make sure that that is being understood is the thing that I think helps out with that. But I'm so open to hear what y'all think.
I would say for Florida, since we have Governor DeSantis and the election police put in place, it's difficult with having security or policing at polling locations because it scares people, if we're going to be honest. If you pull up to your local library and you see like 2 police officers sitting outside on election day, you kind of gonna give a side eye, like why are they here, what's going on? And especially for returning citizens, with everything that I mentioned before, with they're getting issued voter registration cards, but months later they're being arrested for doing something that they were issued permission basically to do. So I think with having, it's like a two-edged sword basically. So having security and policing at polling location to protect the poll workers, and I have served as an election day poll worker, that is ideal for the safety after everything that happened with January 6th and the 2020 election. But on the other end, on the other side, it's also going to be sort of a scare tactic, because what if people hear about police, there will be a police presence at all polling locations? What if some crazy people just show up in police gear pretending to be police and they're actually there to intimidate voters that day? So on one hand, as a previous election day poll worker, I would love the security of it, but on the other hand, as a black citizen in America, I understand our relationship with police and how it might not be the best. So I think it's probably a state by state and a county by county situation, and I'm pretty sure the mayors can speak more to what they've done to ensure the protection of their poll workers. But yeah, go ahead.
You know, we've worked very closely with the county election board to ensure that they're not only poll workers, because that's important, but poll watchers or election day watchers, and people who go from poll to poll addressing complaints, paying attention to whether or not there's somebody out there trying to intimidate voters, because that is, I mean, you have to be vigilant and you want to protect workers, but you also want to protect the pathway for voters. And if I'm a returning citizen, heck, if I'm not a returning citizen and I see the police sitting out there, I'm like, nah, I'm gonna come back later and just wait. But, you know, what if later doesn't happen, or what if later is too late? You have to be careful with that type of intimidation.
I have one last question for you guys before we go into our question and answer segment. In a single sentence, what would you say to inspire confidence in future generations in our electoral system?
Sorry, I shouldn't roll my eyes. To inspire confidence in the future of our electoral system, you know, I think despite all the challenges, the mayor mentioned 2008, and think about all of the challenges thrown in the way of people having the opportunity to vote and to vote for a candidate of their choosing. And we still, in spite of whatever issues occurred, I think we're able to get there. Fast forward to 2020. And despite the fact that you had election denialism that started before the actual election itself, by the way, you had a president actually saying, don't trust them, this is all unbelievable, don't do this, right? We still had the system work fundamentally, ultimately. And so to me, I think it is, while an incredibly imperfect system, it's one that when we stand up and when we vote and when we organize, often we'll get the right result. And so for me, that's what gives me confidence, the fact that we are building on, I think, stronger foundation now.
I think the mayor is absolutely right. I think the other thing that I would say is get involved. Familiarity with anything allows you to trust it more. So if you've become familiar with the system, then you're going to trust it and want to even have an impact, a positive impact on the process.
I would say being educated and being engaged is what's going to push our democracy in the right direction. And I say that to say the more that we're educating ourselves and our circles, and as the mayor stated earlier, if we just call 10 of our family and friends to ensure that they've checked their voter registration status, that they know their polling location, we're making more of a difference than being on the front lines on election day, canvassing for a specific candidate. So being educated and being engaged in the system and basically just pushing for a more just system as we move forward through the next election, and seeing who's going to be our next leader. I think those two things will get us pretty far.
I agree that engagement is really important. If you have any lack of confidence, your secretary of election in your county is there. You can call and ask all the questions that you want to ask. Like I say, put people to work. They're there for a reason. They have all the information. They should be able to answer any question that you have. Just be engaging and educate yourself as much as possible.
Thank you.